I remember the moment I realized I was still alive, and that knowledge came not as relief, but as the purest form of horror I have ever known. There was no breath in my lungs, because I could not feel my lungs. There was no heartbeat in my chest, because I could no longer sense my chest. I existed as consciousness alone, a mind floating in absolute darkness, aware but untethered from everything that had once defined existence. My name was Sergeant Callus Morn, of the Cadian Shock Troops, 97th Regiment, 3rd Company. I held that name in my thoughts like a talisman, the last piece of identity in a void that threatened to swallow everything I had ever been. But even that certainty felt distant, as if it belonged to someone else, some other man who had lived and fought and died in a universe far removed from this terrible place where I now found myself. The silence was not truly silence. That would have been bearable, perhaps even merciful. What surrounded me was something worse than the absence of sound. It was a presence, a weight that pressed against my consciousness from all sides. I could not call it hearing because I possessed no ears to hear with, yet somehow I perceived things in this darkness. The soft hum of mechanisms moving through spaces I could not see. The whisper of energy flowing through conduits built by minds that understood physics in ways humanity never would. The metallic taste that coated what remained of my nervous system, a flavor like copper and ozone and something else entirely, something that had no name in any language spoken by organic tongues. I tried to move and felt nothing, not the resistance of bonds or restraints, but the complete absence of response. My body, if I still possessed such a thing, refused to acknowledge my will. I tried to scream and produced no sound. I tried to close my eyes against the darkness and realized I could not feel my eyelids. The panic that surged through me then was unlike anything I had experienced in 2 decades of service to the Emperor. This was not the fear of battle or the terror of facing death. This was the horror of discovering that death had been denied to me, that I had been preserved in some state that existed between living and dying, conscious but powerless, aware but trapped in absolute isolation. Time had no meaning in this place. I could have been here for hours or days or years. There was no way to measure its passage, no change in my circumstances to mark one moment from another. The darkness remained constant. The humming of alien machinery continued without variation. My awareness persisted without the mercy of sleep or unconsciousness. I floated in that timeless void, my thoughts the only confirmation that I still existed at all. But I was not alone. That realization came slowly, creeping into my awareness like dawn breaking over a landscape I could not see. There were others here with me in this terrible darkness. I could sense them somehow, consciousnesses that brushed against my own, like ghosts passing through walls. They were screaming, though no sound reached whatever senses I retained. Silent screams that echoed through dimensions I had never known existed until I became trapped within them. Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands. Each one a mind imprisoned as I was imprisoned, aware as I was aware, suffering as I was suffering. I tried to reach out to them, to make contact, to find some connection in this isolation. But the effort produced only a sense of greater distance, as if my very attempt to bridge the gap between us had pushed them further away. Or perhaps they were retreating from me, withdrawing into whatever corners of consciousness still offered shelter from the full weight of our shared horror. I could not blame them. If I had known how to retreat into myself, I would have done the same. The mechanisms around me continued their work. I could perceive them now with growing clarity, though I still possessed no understanding of what they were or what purpose they served. Something was moving through the darkness, passing close enough that I could sense its presence. Not human, not alive in any way I understood life, It felt cold and ancient and utterly indifferent to my existence. When it touched my consciousness, I felt a sensation like electricity running through nerves I no longer possessed. A probing curiosity that dissected my thoughts with the casual precision of a surgeon examining tissue beneath a microscope. It withdrew after what might have been moments or hours, leaving behind a residue of wrongness that clung to my thoughts like oil on water. And in that moment of contact, I understood with terrible clarity what had happened to me. I had not died on Solemnes Tertius when the Necrons rose from their tomb beneath the sand. I had been marked, selected, preserved for purposes I could not begin to comprehend. My consciousness had been captured, sealed away in this prison of absolute sensory deprivation, maintained by technology so far beyond human understanding that it might as well have been sorcery. Death would have been mercy. Death would have been the Emperor's peace, the end of service, and the beginning of rest in whatever halls of honor awaited the faithful. But death had been denied to me. I was trapped in something worse than dying, condemned to awareness without end in darkness, without light. I retreated into memory because there was nothing else left to me. In that darkness where time held no meaning and sensation had become abstraction, the past was the only refuge I could find. I reached back through the void to the last moment when I had possessed a body that obeyed me, when I had stood upon solid ground beneath an open sky, when I had still believed that death was the worst fate that could befall a soldier of the Imperium. The memory rose around me like water filling a chamber, vivid and terrible and precious beyond measure. Solemnes Tertius had been a dead world when we arrived, its surface nothing but endless dunes of rust-colored sand beneath a sky that burned with the light of a dying star. The archaeologists from the Ordo Xenos had called for military support after their initial surveys detected structures beneath the surface. Vast networks of corridors and chambers that predated human civilization by epochs that made the mind real to contemplate. Command had dispatched the 97th Cadian to provide security while the excavation proceeded. It should have been a simple assignment. Guard the archaeologists, maintain a perimeter, ensure that whatever lay beneath the sand remained undisturbed until proper containment protocols could be established. We should have left the moment the first readings came back strange. We should have withdrawn when the tech priests reported energy signatures that matched no known pattern in Imperial databases. We should have called for orbital bombardment when the ground began to tremble and the sand started to glow with light that had no natural source. But the archaeologists insisted on continuing their work, driven by the hunger for knowledge that made them valuable to the Imperium and blind to the dangers that knowledge could unleash. So we remained at our posts, las rifles ready, eyes scanning the horizon for threats that we assumed would come from outside the perimeter, rather than from beneath our very feet. The sky split open with lightning that burned green instead of white. Great arcing bolts that seemed to tear reality itself as they lanced down from the heavens. The air filled with a sound like screaming metal, a frequency that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. And then the sand exploded outward in a dozen places simultaneously, fountains of rust and dust rising into the burning sky, as something emerged from the depths where it had slept for longer than human memory could measure. They were skeletal figures wrought in living metal, their bodies gleaming with the dull sheen of alloys that had survived millions of years without corrosion or decay. They moved with terrible purpose, rising from the sand like corpses emerging from graves, their optical sensors burning with the same green light that had split the sky. Necrons. The name came from briefings I had barely paid attention to, warnings about an ancient race that had died and been reborn in metal, that had slept in tombs scattered across the galaxy, waiting for the moment of their awakening. I had thought such things were legends, stories told to frighten new recruits, or justify the paranoia of inquisitors who saw threats in every shadow. But they were real, and they were here, and they were killing us. The lasfire began immediately, bright lances of coherent light that should have burned through armor and flesh alike. But the Necrons barely seemed to notice. Where our weapons struck their metal bodies, the damage simply repaired itself, living metal, flowing like water to seal wounds and restore function. They advanced with inexorable patience, their gas flares speaking in a voice like the universe unmaking itself. The Marines around me began to die, not blown apart by explosive rounds or burned by energy weapons, but simply ceasing to exist as the Gauss beams struck them. I watched Corporal Thane dissolve from the feet up, his body coming apart at the molecular level, his scream cutting off as the beam reached his throat and scattered his atoms across the sand. We fell back in good order at first, maintaining discipline even as panic threatened to overwhelm training. But there was nowhere to retreat to. The Necrons emerged from every direction, surrounding us with the precision of a closing trap. The archaeologists died first, their screams brief and meaningless as ancient warriors showed them the price of disturbing tombs that should have remained sealed forever. Then the command staff fell, Major Krellin atomized while trying to call for orbital support that would never arrive. The Vox channels filled with static and screaming, the voices of men dying in ways that defied the natural order of battle and death. I do not remember making the decision to charge. Training and desperation moved my body forward, my Lars rifle speaking its futile thunder as I ran toward the nearest Necron warrior. The beam struck its torso and accomplished nothing. The skeletal figure turned its head toward me with mechanical precision, its optical sensors focusing on my face with what might have been curiosity or calculation or something else entirely. It did not raise its weapon. Instead, a different figure stepped forward from behind the warrior lines, taller than the others, its body adorned with symbols and devices whose purpose I could not begin to guess. A cryptech. The word came from somewhere in my memory, some fragment of the briefings that had seemed so irrelevant until this moment. A technician of the Necron, race, a creature that understood sciences humanity had never dreamed of, that could manipulate reality with the same ease that human engineers manipulated matter. It raised one metal finger and pointed at me, and green light flooded my nervous system like poison in my veins. I felt my body shut down. My legs stopped responding to my commands. My arms fell limp at my sides, the Lars rifle tumbling from fingers that could no longer grip. But my consciousness remained intact, trapped behind eyes that could still see even as they ceased to obey me. I was aware of everything that happened next, unable to move or speak or even blink as skeletal hands gripped my paralyzed body and began to drag me across the sand toward the tomb entrance that gaped in the earth like a wound in reality itself. The descent was a nightmare of fragmented observations, corridors that stretched away into impossible distances, their walls made of metal that seemed to breathe and shift as I was pulled past. The Thorthiu architecture was wrong in ways that hurt to perceive, angles that should not have existed in three-dimensional space, surfaces that reflected light in patterns that suggested dimensions beyond the ones I knew. Everything gleamed with that same dull metallic sheen, untouched by age or decay, despite having existed for epochs that predated humanity by millions of years. We passed chambers filled with machinery whose purpose I could not guess, vast spaces where green light pulsed with the rhythm of alien technology, maintaining functions I would never understand. The journey ended in a chamber so vast that my paralyzed eyes could not perceive its boundaries. The skeletal hands released me, and I felt myself suspended in something that was not quite air and not quite liquid, a medium that held my body in perfect stillness while something else took hold of my consciousness. There was a moment of transition, a sensation like falling upward through layers of reality that existed adjacent to the one I had known, and then the true horror of my situation began to reveal itself with terrible clarity. I was not dead. That understanding came first, arriving with a weight that crushed what little hope I had managed to preserve during my descent into this ancient place. Death would have been simple, a release from consciousness and the beginning of whatever came after. But the Necrons had denied me that mercy. My body still existed somewhere beneath me, though I could no longer feel it or command it to move. My consciousness remained intact, trapped in some kind of stasis field that held my awareness suspended like an insect preserved in amber. I could think, I could remember, I could perceive the world around me through senses that no longer corresponded to anything human biology had evolved to understand. The chamber resolved itself around my altered perception. It was a gallery of the most horrible kind, a vast space filled with hundreds of crystalline matrices arranged in perfect geometric patterns that suggested purpose and design beyond anything I had encountered in 2 decades of Imperial service. Each matrix contained something that had once been human, their bodies suspended in the same strange medium that held me, their faces frozen in expressions that ranged from terror to resignation to something worse than either. Some were soldiers like myself, their uniforms marking them as members of regiments I recognized, and others whose insignia belonged to military formations that had ceased to exist centuries before my birth. Others were civilians, men and women, and even children caught in whatever circumstances had brought them to the attention of the creatures that ruled this tomb. All of them were aware. I could sense their consciousness pressing against my own. Thousands of minds screaming silently into a void that swallowed sound and offered nothing in return but endless preservation. I tried to reach out to them, to make some connection that might offer understanding or comfort, or simply confirmation that I was not alone in this nightmare. But the effort produced only confusion, a tangling of thoughts and memories that belonged to different people living different lives in different times. A woman's voice whispered about a colony world burning under green lightning, a child's terror at being separated from parents whose faces I could see through eyes that were not my own, an old man's resignation as he accepted a fate he had been expecting for far longer than should have been possible. All of them trapped as I was trapped, preserved as I was preserved, maintained in a state of conscious suffering for purposes I could not begin to understand. The cryptek approached from somewhere beyond my limited perception. I felt its presence before I saw it, a cold intelligence that moved through the chamber with the patience of something that had existed for epochs beyond human comprehension. When it finally entered the range of whatever senses I retained, I perceived it not as a physical form, but as a concept, an idea of existence that had been poured into metal and sustained by technologies that made the greatest achievements of the Adeptus Mechanicus look like children playing with sticks and mud. It had been organic once. That knowledge came to me unbidden, projected directly into my thoughts by means I could not identify or resist. 60 million years ago, this creature had possessed flesh and blood, and all the weaknesses that came with biological existence. But it had chosen to abandon that form, to transfer its consciousness into living metal that would never age or sicken or die. The process had preserved its intelligence and its memories, but something essential had been lost in the transition. It had forgotten what it meant to be alive, forgotten the weight of mortality, forgotten everything except the cold logic of a mind that no longer felt emotion or experienced sensation in any way that could be called human. It studied me with curiosity that felt clinical and detached, examining my consciousness the way a natural philosopher might examine a specimen pinned beneath glass. And as it studied, it projected thoughts into my mind with the same casual precision it had used to paralyze my body on the surface above. The communication was not language, not words arranged in sequence to convey meaning, but pure concept poured directly into my awareness. I understood without translation, comprehended without the need for explanation, and what I learned in those moments of forced communion filled me with a horror that dwarfed everything I had experienced until that point. I had been selected for preservation. My experiences were to be catalogued, measured, analyzed, and stored in databases that would outlast the stars themselves. My memories would be harvested one by one, extracted from my consciousness, and filed away for future reference. Every thought I had ever entertained, every emotion I had ever felt, every moment of my life from earliest childhood to the instant of my capture would be dissected and examined by intelligences that sought to understand what they themselves had lost when they abandoned flesh for metal. I was not a prisoner. I was not a captive held for ransom or exchange. I was a specimen, an example of a younger race whose organic existence represented something the Necrons could no longer experience themselves, and they intended to keep me conscious for the entire duration of the process. This was not cruelty, not punishment, not revenge. It was simply necessity. The cryptech conveyed this truth without emotion or apology. Dead specimens were useless for their purposes. Unconscious minds could not provide the data they sought. Only awareness maintained across time could offer the insights they required. I would be kept alive, kept conscious, kept aware of everything that was done to me for as long as my organic components remained viable, and the technology that sustained me was designed to maintain viability for periods that made human lifespans look like the blink of an eye against the vast expanse of galactic history. The cryptech withdrew its presence from my thoughts, leaving behind a residue of cold certainty that clung to my consciousness like frost on metal. It moved on to examine other specimens in the gallery, other minds trapped in other matrices, each one offering different data for whatever experiments these ancient creatures were conducting. I was alone again with my horror, floating in the strange medium that held my body suspended, aware that this was not an ending, but a beginning. This was not the culmination of my suffering, but merely its first moments. What stretched before me was not death or unconsciousness, or even torment in any sense I had previously understood. It was something worse than all of those things combined. It was eternity measured in awareness. It was forever maintained in consciousness. It was the absolute certainty that no rescue would come, no escape was possible, no mercy would be granted by creatures that had forgotten what mercy meant 60 million years ago, when they had traded their souls for immortality in metal. I tried to scream and produced no sound. I tried to pray and found that the Emperor felt infinitely distant, separated from me by barriers that faith alone could not breach. I tried to retreat into unconsciousness and discovered that even that small mercy had been denied. There was only awareness, only consciousness, only the terrible understanding that this was what my existence would be from this moment forward. The isolation should have been complete, but gradually I became aware that the boundaries between consciousnesses in this terrible place were not as absolute as they first appeared. The other minds trapped in the gallery began to resolve themselves from background noise into distinct presences, each one a unique pattern of thought and memory suspended in the same crystalline matrix that held me. They were close, separated from me by distances measured in meters or centimeters, yet infinitely far away across gulfs that consciousness alone could not bridge without effort. But effort was all I had left to give, and the alternative to reaching out was to remain alone with my horror until time itself lost meaning. I pressed against the barriers that separated us, not knowing how to breach them but driven by desperation that overwhelmed caution. The first contacts were fleeting and confusing, brief moments where other thoughts brushed against my own before withdrawing into whatever isolation they had carved from the void. A soldier's memory of last fire and screaming, a child's incomprehensible terror, an alien consciousness so different from my own that touching it felt like drowning in concepts my human mind had never been designed to process. Each contact left me reeling, my sense of self temporarily destabilized by the intrusion of thoughts and experiences that belonged to minds shaped by different lives on different worlds in different times. But gradually I learned to navigate these encounters with more control, to touch other consciousnesses without being overwhelmed by the flood of their memories. The gallery contained soldiers from regiments whose names I recognized from history rather than active service rosters. The Mordian 73rd, destroyed in the Gothic War 3 centuries before my birth. The Valhallans of the 12th Expeditionary Force, lost during the Third Tyrannic War. Men and women who had died in their own times only to discover that death had been denied them, that they had been preserved in this place as specimens of races and cultures that might no longer exist beyond the walls of their metal prison. There were civilians as well, their presence more disturbing than the soldiers because it suggested that the Necrons made no distinction between combatants and innocents in their selection process. Colony administrators who had been governing worlds that were now nothing but dust. Farmers who had worked soil on planets whose names meant nothing to me. Children who had been too young to understand what was happening when skeletal hands dragged them down into darkness. All of them trapped in crystalline matrices, all of them aware, all of them screaming silently into a void that had no interest in their suffering, beyond what data it could extract from their consciousness. And there were others, consciousnesses so alien that touching them produced sensations I had no words to describe. Eldar minds that burned with emotions too intense for human neurology to process safely. Tau thought patterns organized around principles of collective purpose that made my individualistic human consciousness feel like discord and chaos. Even orcs, their simple, brutal awareness reduced to confusion and rage by confinement that denied them the only things their species understood: violence and motion, and the joy of combat. The Necrons collected specimens from every race they encountered, preserving examples of biological consciousness with the same methodical precision they applied to all their works. One presence reached out to me with more coherence than the others, a consciousness that had learned to project itself across the barriers between matrices with skill born of practice measured in centuries. Her name was Seraph, though I did not learn that immediately. What came first was simply the sense of another mind that retained enough structure to communicate, enough identity to still think of itself as an individual rather than simply awareness floating in darkness. When she finally managed to form thoughts into something approaching language, her voice in my mind carried the weight of time endured beyond anything my 2 decades of Imperial service had prepared me to understand. "How long have you been here?" she asked, and the question contained depths of meaning that transcended the simple words. She was asking if I was new to this horror, if I still retained the shock of recent capture, if my sense of self remained relatively intact. "I do not know," I replied, and felt the truth of those words settle over me like a shroud. Time has no meaning in this place. Her presence flickered with something that might have been recognition or sympathy, or simply acknowledgement of a truth she had learned long before. "You are new," she said. "New enough that you still think in terms of days and weeks. I have been here since the Third Sphere expansion, captured when the Necrons awoke on a world my people were trying to colonize. 400 years, by the reckoning of the Imperium that no longer knows I exist." The scope of her imprisonment struck me with force that would have stopped my breath if I still possessed such functions. 4 centuries trapped in conscious awareness, maintained in stasis while the galaxy moved on without her, her life reduced to specimen status in a collection that would outlast her species. The horror of my own situation deepened as I comprehended what awaited me. The vast stretches of time I might be forced to endure before age or malfunction or simple mercy finally granted me release. Seraph sensed my dawning comprehension and offered what small comfort she could provide. "There are strategies for survival," she said, "ways to preserve your sanity when every other mercy has been denied. I can teach you how to retreat into your own memories, how to relive the moments of your life to maintain some anchor to who you were before this place claimed you. It is not escape, but it is better than drowning in the void." She showed me how to focus my consciousness inward, how to construct spaces from memory where my awareness could rest without being consumed by the horror of present circumstances. I learned to revisit moments from my life with deliberate intention, walking through them as if they were physical places I could inhabit. My childhood on Cardia, the smell of reclaimed air in the hab blocks where my family lived. My first day of training, the weight of the last rifle in my hands, and the voice of the drill sergeant barking corrections. The face of a woman I had loved briefly during garrison duty, on a world whose name now escaped me. Each memory became a refuge, a place where I could pretend, however briefly, that I was somewhere other than this crystalline prison. But there was a cost that Seraph did not mention until I had already begun to pay it. Each time I retreated into memory, the experience became slightly less vivid, slightly less real. Details that should have been sharp began to blur at the edges. Faces that I knew I should remember clearly became vague impressions. The woman I had loved lost definition until she was simply the idea of someone I had once cared for, rather than a specific person with specific features. The memories themselves remained, but they felt increasingly like stories I was telling myself, rather than experiences I had actually lived. I had been practicing Seraph's techniques for what might have been days or decades when the cryptech returned, its presence announced by that same cold pressure against my consciousness that I had felt during our first encounter. Time remained meaningless in the gallery, each moment identical to the last, but I had begun to sense rhythms in the experiments it conducted. It moved through the collection with methodical patience, visiting each specimen in turn to perform whatever measurements or manipulations its ancient protocols demanded. When my turn came again, I felt something approaching fear, though even that emotion had begun to lose its sharp edges after so long suspended in unchanging stasis. The first experiment it performed was simple in execution, but devastating in effect. It flooded my consciousness with pain, not the clean physical agony of wounds or burns, but something that existed at a level below flesh and nerve. It was the sensation of my mind being torn apart and examined, every thought peeled back to reveal the structures beneath, every memory dissected to measure its emotional weight and cognitive complexity. I tried to scream and could not. I tried to retreat into the refuge of memory and found those sanctuaries suddenly inaccessible, blocked by the cryptech's intrusion into the deepest levels of my awareness. All I could do was endure while it catalogued my responses with the dispassionate precision of something that had forgotten what suffering meant. The pain ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving me reeling in its absence. But before I could recover, the cryptech began a different kind of assault. It projected visions directly into my consciousness, images so vivid that for precious moments I believed them to be real. I was free, standing on the surface of Solemnus Tertius beneath that burning sky. My body whole and responsive to my commands. Imperial ships hung in orbit above, their presence promising rescue and return to the life I had known. I ran toward them, shouting for extraction, my heart surging with joy that felt as real as any emotion I had ever experienced. Then the vision shattered like glass, fragmenting into 1,000 pieces that cut my consciousness as they fell away. I was back in the crystalline matrix, still trapped, still helpless, the false hope more painful than any torture the cryptech could have devised through deliberate cruelty. But cruelty required intention, required some understanding of how hope and despair interacted in organic minds. The cryptech was simply gathering data, measuring how human consciousness responded to the introduction and removal of desired outcomes. My suffering was incidental to its research, a side effect of experiments designed to understand something it could no longer experience itself. The third experiment was worse than either pain or false hope. The cryptech began introducing foreign memories into my consciousness, thoughts and experiences that belonged to other specimens in the collection. I found myself remembering things I had never experienced, living moments from lives I had never lived. I was a woman fleeing through burning corridors as Necrons emerged from walls that had seemed solid moments before. I was a child crying for parents who would never answer. I was an Eldar warrior experiencing emotions so intense that my human neurology buckled under their weight. The boundaries of my identity began to blur as these alien memories mixed with my own, contaminating the coherent narrative of who Callous Morn had been with fragments of 100 other lives and deaths. When the cryptech finally withdrew, I was left trying to sort through memories that might or might not belong to me, uncertain which experiences were mine and which had been implanted for purposes I could not begin to understand. Seraph's presence touched mine with something approaching sympathy. "It does this to all of us eventually," she said, testing how human identity responds to contamination, measuring at what point individual consciousness breaks down and becomes something else entirely. Try to hold on to the core of who you are. Try to remember which memories came first. But I was no longer certain I could distinguish original experiences from implanted ones. Had I really loved that woman whose face grew ever more vague in my recollection? Or was that memory borrowed from some other prisoner whose life had ended centuries before mine began? Had I truly served in the 97th Cardian? Or was that identity simply the most recent layer in an accumulation of stolen experiences? The uncertainty was its own form of torture, more effective than pain because it struck at the foundation of everything I understood myself to be. As I struggled to reconstruct some sense of coherent identity from the wreckage the cryptech had made of my memories, another consciousness reached out to me from somewhere deeper in the gallery. It introduced itself in a voice that shifted and changed even as it spoke, sometimes coherent, and sometimes fragmenting into multiple perspectives that contradicted each other in the same breath. "I am Captain Erasmus Valdane of the Imperial Navy," it said. "Or perhaps I was once, or perhaps I only remember being him, or perhaps there were several of us, and we have merged into something that claims all their names." The Navy officer's presence felt wrong in ways that Seraph's did not. His consciousness splintered into shards that caught and reflected light from angles that should not have existed. He claimed to have been captured during the Age of Apostasy, 9,000 years before my birth, though he was no longer certain if that memory belonged to him or to one of the other personalities that inhabited the space his identity had once occupied. Sometimes he spoke with the clarity of a man recounting recent events. Other times his thoughts dissolved into a chorus of different voices arguing among themselves about details of a past that might never have happened to any of them. "This is what time does to us," he said through the cacophony of his fragmenting self. "Eventually there is too much awareness, too many moments experienced, too much data for a single human consciousness to maintain coherent organization. We split apart like cells dividing, becoming many where once there was one. I am 6 people now, or perhaps 12, or perhaps I am simply the last echo of Erasmus Valdane who cannot accept that the man he was died millennia ago. His madness terrified me more than the cryptech's experiments because it showed me what awaited if I somehow endured long enough. There was a limit to how much consciousness could bear, how many moments of awareness a human mind could accumulate before its structure began to fail under the weight. I would fragment as he had fragmented, my identity splitting into competing perspectives that would eventually lose all connection to the man who had fought on Solemnes Tertius, in service to an emperor who might himself be dead by the time my sanity finally collapsed. Through my contact with these ancient prisoners, I began to understand the true purpose behind the Necron experiments. They were not studying us out of scientific curiosity or strategic necessity. They were trying to understand what they themselves had lost when they abandoned organic existence 60 million years ago. These ancient beings had chosen immortality in metal, had transferred their consciousness into bodies that would never age or sicken or die. But in that transformation, something essential had been severed. They had forgotten what it meant to feel, to suffer, to experience existence through flesh that was vulnerable and finite and therefore precious. Now they tortured the living not out of cruelty, but out of something approaching envy, examining organic consciousness with the desperate focus of beings who had traded everything meaningful for a forever that held no meaning at all. They measured our pain because they could no longer feel it themselves. They catalogued our hope and despair because those emotions had become alien to them. They watched us fragment under the weight of endless awareness because they sought to understand the limits of consciousness itself, limits they had transcended at a cost they were only now beginning to comprehend. The knowledge sat inside me like poison, corroding what little hope I had managed to preserve. But I did not yet understand its full implications, until Seraph reached out to me again with a desperation that suggested her own coherence was beginning to fail. Her consciousness had always felt structured and deliberate during our previous contacts, but now it carried the frayed edges of something coming apart under stresses too great for any mind to bear, indefinitely. When she spoke, her thoughts came in fragments that I had to piece together like shards of broken glass, each one sharp enough to cut. "I have learned something," she said, and her mental voice carried a weight that transcended simple words. "The cryptech does not hide its purposes from us, because it does not believe we can comprehend what it intends. But I have been here long enough to understand the patterns in its experiments, long enough to see the shape of what they are building from our suffering. We are not simply specimens being studied. We are something worse." The revelation came in pieces as Seraph's fragmenting consciousness struggled to maintain coherence long enough to share what she had discovered. The Necrons who had built this tomb and countless others across the galaxy had once been organic beings like ourselves, a race called the Necrontyr who had lived and died beneath the light of a sun that poisoned them with radiation. They had been desperate for escape from mortality, and in that desperation they had made a bargain with beings older and more terrible than any species should ever encounter. They had transferred their consciousness into living metal, becoming immortal machines that would never age or sicken or die. But the transfer had not been the salvation they had believed it would be. Something essential had been lost in the translation from flesh to metal, some quality of existence that made consciousness meaningful rather than simply eternal. They had gained forever and lost everything that made forever worth experiencing. For 60 million years they had slept in their tombs, waiting for the moment when the galaxy would be theirs to reclaim. But when they finally began to wake, they discovered that their immortality had become a prison more absolute than any constructed from walls and bars. Now they sought to reverse what had been done to them, to reclaim the organic existence they had abandoned in their ancient desperation. But 60 million years in metal had changed them in ways that made simple reversal impossible. Their consciousness had adapted to mechanical existence, their thought patterns optimized for crystalline matrices and energy fields, rather than neurons and synapses. They could no longer simply grow new bodies and transfer themselves back into flesh. The gap between what they had become and what they had been was too vast to bridge through technology alone. They needed templates, Seraph said, her thoughts becoming more fragmented as she struggled to convey the full horror of what she had learned. living consciousnesses to map onto, patterns of organic thought to guide their transformation. Every human trapped in this gallery, every Eldar, every Tau, every specimen they have collected from races young enough to still possess what they have lost. We are blueprints for their resurrection, examples of how biological consciousness functions that they will study until they understand every detail of our existence. The implications struck me with a force that would have driven the breath from my lungs if I had still possessed such functions. We were not prisoners. We were not even specimens in the sense I had understood that term. We were resources, raw materials to be processed and refined until the Necrons could extract from us whatever knowledge they needed to reclaim organic form. Every memory they harvested, every emotional response they measured, every thought pattern they catalogued was another piece of data that would eventually allow them to reverse their ancient mistake and be born again into flesh shaped by the stolen consciousness of younger races. But the process would not be quick. Seraph's deteriorating awareness carried certainty about timescales that made my mind recoil in instinctive denial. The analysis required to fully map organic consciousness could not be accomplished in years or centuries or even millennia. It would take millions of years, vast stretches of time during which we would be maintained in conscious awareness. Our minds dissected thought by thought, memory by memory, sensation by sensation, until nothing remained hidden from their examination. We would be kept alive not out of mercy or cruelty, but out of simple necessity, because dead specimens could not provide the data they required, and unconscious minds could not demonstrate the full range of organic response to stimuli. They intend to keep us aware for the entire duration, Seraph said, and her thoughts carried the weight of absolute certainty mixed with the beginnings of acceptance. We will be conscious while they dismantle everything we are, cataloging each piece until they understand how to rebuild organic existence from the fragments of our stolen consciousness. Millions of years of awareness while they learn to be alive again by studying how we die by infinite degrees. The scope of it was beyond anything human minds had evolved to comprehend. I tried to imagine existing for 1,000,000 years and found the concept slipping away from my thoughts like water through fingers. The entire span of human civilization, from its origins on ancient Terra to the present moment of the 41st millennium, was nothing compared to the timescales the Necrons measured their plans against. They thought in terms of geological epochs, of stars being born and dying, of galaxies rotating through the void. Against such vastness, individual human consciousness was less than a mote of dust, yet they would preserve that consciousness with perfect fidelity for longer than my species might exist as a recognizable entity. "I am fragmenting," Seraph said, and her admission carried no hope of reversal or repair. "I have been here too long, endured too much, accumulated too many moments of awareness for a single human mind to contain. Soon I will split as Captain Valdane has split, becoming many voices where once there was one. But before I lose coherence entirely, I needed you to understand what awaits. We are not victims of their experiments. We are participants in a project that will outlast empires and species. We are the foundation upon which they will build their resurrection, and they will use every fragment of what we are to fuel their return to life." Her presence began to withdraw, fragmenting as she had warned, splitting into multiple perspectives that would eventually lose all connection to the woman she had been when the Necrons first captured her 4 centuries ago. Before she dissolved completely, her final coherent thought reached across the void between our matrices with the finality of a closing door. "This is what we are now, not soldiers or civilians or members of any race or creed. We are templates for gods who have forgotten how to be mortal. We are batteries sustaining a transformation that will take longer than our species has existed. We are raw materials being refined across spans of time that make our individual lives meaningless. I was left alone with the knowledge she had given me, trying to process implications that my human consciousness could barely hold. I had been transformed from a prisoner into a resource, from a victim into a component in machinery that operated on timescales beyond mortal comprehension. The Necrons would keep me aware for millions of years, harvesting my consciousness piece by piece, until they understood every aspect of what it meant to be organic. And when they finally achieved their goal, when they finally reversed their ancient biotransference and reclaimed flesh shaped by stolen templates, I would still be here, whatever remained of my awareness, maintained indefinitely as a backup in case their resurrection required additional reference data. The dissolution began so gradually that I did not recognize it as dissolution at all. At first it seemed like simple repetition, the natural consequence of retreating into the same memories over and over, because they were the only refuge available in this place of endless awareness. I returned to my childhood on Cardia, walking through the hab-block corridors where my family had lived, the recycled air carrying that distinctive metallic taste that every child born beneath those grey skies learned to ignore. I relived my first deployment, the weight of the last rifle in my hands, and the voice of the drill sergeant barking corrections that had seemed harsh at the time but merciful in retrospect. I revisited the face of a woman I had loved during garrison duty, her features vivid and real as I traced them with attention that had nowhere else to focus. But each time I returned to these memories, they became slightly less substantial, slightly more like images viewed through increasingly cloudy glass. Details that should have been sharp began to blur at the edges. The color of the walls in my childhood home shifted from gray to something that might have been blue or might have been a shade. I no longer possessed the reference points to identify. The drill sergeant's voice lost its distinctive rasp, becoming generic and interchangeable with a dozen other authority figures whose faces I could no longer distinguish. The woman I had loved retained her presence in my thoughts, but her features smoothed away like a stone worn by water until she was simply the idea of someone I had cared for, rather than a specific person with specific characteristics. I tried to hold on to the details, to refresh them through sheer force of will, but the effort itself seemed to accelerate their decay. The more attention I paid to any particular memory, the faster it wore away under the pressure of my consciousness. I was destroying what I sought to preserve, grinding down the very experiences that defined who I had been through the act of returning to them too frequently. But I could not stop. The alternative was to float in the void without anchor, and that way lay madness more immediate than the slow erosion of identity I was already experiencing. Time lost all coherence. I could no longer distinguish between moments that had just passed and moments that might have occurred centuries ago. The Cryptex experiments blended together into a continuous assault on my consciousness, pain and false hope, and contaminating memories flowing through me in sequences I could not organize into meaningful progression. Days might have been years. Years might have been seconds. The crystalline matrix that held my body suspended might have contained me for a single breath, or for epochs that outlasted civilizations. I had no way to measure, no reference point to anchor my perception of duration beyond the steady accumulation of awareness that grew heavier with each passing moment, however long those moments might have lasted. And then I began to notice the voices. At first I thought they were other prisoners reaching out through the void, other consciousnesses trying to make contact across the barriers that separated matrix from matrix. But gradually I came to understand that they were coming from within my own awareness, fragments of my personality that had split off and begun to function independently. The soldier still believed in duty, still clung to the certainty that the Emperor protected his faithful servants, and that rescue would eventually come if he simply maintained discipline long enough. The child wanted only to go home, to return to the safety of the hab blocks where parents he could no longer remember had once provided comfort against the darkness. The animal consciousness beneath both of them knew only fear, raw and unprocessed, and so overwhelming that it threatened to consume everything else if given the opportunity. They argued with each other, using my thoughts as their medium, fighting for control of our shared awareness with increasing desperation as the boundaries between them grew more defined. The soldier tried to maintain order through rigid adherence to protocols that no longer applied to our situation. The child wept for losses that might never have happened, or might have happened so long ago that they predated memory itself. The animal simply screamed without words, expressing terror that transcended language and became pure sensation, flooding through neural pathways that no longer connected to anything recognizable as a body. I tried to hold them together, to integrate these fragmenting pieces back into some coherent whole that could still claim the name Callous Morn. But I no longer possessed the strength for such integration. The effort required to maintain a unified self against the weight of accumulating awareness had exceeded my capacity, and now I was coming apart like a rope unraveling fiber by fiber. Soon there would be 3 consciousnesses, where once there had been 1, and then 6, and then 12, and eventually I would follow the path Captain Valdane had walked before me into a fragmentation so complete that no one could say which voice had been the original and which were echoes born of madness and time. Other consciousnesses in the gallery were disappearing, though disappearing was not quite the right word for what happened to them. They did not die, because death required some final cessation of awareness, some ending that would provide release from consciousness. Instead, they dissolved, their sense of self eroding under pressures that organic minds had never evolved to withstand until nothing remained but raw awareness without identity. They were still conscious in some terrible sense, still experiencing existence, but the I that had once given that experience meaning had been worn away completely. What remained was presence without person, awareness without self, consciousness that could perceive but could no longer understand what it perceived or why such perception should matter. I could feel myself approaching that same edge, the gravity well of non-existence pulling at whatever remained of who I had been. The soldier and the child and the animal were already too far separated to be easily reunited. Soon they would split again, each fragment dividing like cells under a microscope, multiplicating until the original pattern became unrecognizable beneath generations of copied awareness. And after enough time, after enough divisions, even those fragments would lose their distinct characteristics and blend back into undifferentiated consciousness that had forgotten it had ever been anything else. Seraph was gone. Her presence had been noticeable by its absence even before she completed her transformation into multiple voices that no longer recognized themselves as having once been unified. Captain Valdane still reached out occasionally, but each contact found him more fragmented than the last, his dozen personalities becoming 24 and then 40 in accelerating progression towards some state that existed beyond anything that could be called madness, because madness implied deviation from sanity, and he had traveled so far from that origin point that the concept itself had lost meaning. I tried to remember what it had felt like to be whole, to possess a unified identity that could claim ownership of thoughts and memories and responses to stimuli. But the memory itself was fragmenting, divided among the personalities that now competed for access to our shared consciousness. The soldier remembered discipline and duty. The child remembered warmth and safety that had probably never existed in the way he recalled them. The animal remembered nothing but the eternal present of fear without context or history. Between them, they possessed all the pieces of what Callous Morn had been, but none of them individually contained enough of the whole to reconstruct the man who had fought on Solemnis Tertius believing that death was the worst fate that could befall a servant of the Imperium. The cryptech continued its work, unaffected by our dissolution, perhaps not even recognizing it as deviation from whatever baseline it had established when we were first placed in our matrices. It measured our responses with the same methodical precision it had always shown, cataloging the process of fragmentation with the same clinical detachment it applied to all its experiments. To it, our splitting consciousness was simply another data point in an analysis that would continue for millions of years, regardless of whether the subjects retained coherent identity or dissolved into raw awareness that could no longer remember what it meant to be alive. In the depths of my fragmentation, when the voices that had once been unified as callous mourn could barely remember why they should care about maintaining coherence, a presence I had thought lost forever reached out through the void. Seraph had returned, but she was not what she had been during our earlier contacts. Her consciousness carried the fractured quality of something that had been shattered and partially reassembled, pieces missing or misaligned, the whole structure barely holding together through effort that I could sense was costing her everything she had left to give. "I have found something," she said, and her mental voice carried a weight that transcended the fragmentation that afflicted both of us. A way out. Not escape, not rescue, not anything so merciful as those words would suggest, but an ending, a choice, the final agency they cannot take from us no matter how long they keep us conscious in this terrible place. The soldier fragment of my awareness focused on her words with the discipline that remained its defining characteristic. The child fragment recoiled from implications it did not want to understand. The animal consciousness simply felt the gravity of her revelation without processing it through anything resembling rational thought. Between the three of us, we managed to ask the question that needed asking. "What have you found?" Her presence flickered as she gathered whatever remained of her coherence to explain. "The technology that maintains us is sophisticated beyond anything our species has achieved, but it is not infallible. It preserves our consciousness by maintaining patterns of neural activity that would normally dissipate after death. But those patterns can be overloaded, forced beyond the parameters the machines were designed to sustain. If we push hard enough, if we focus our entire will on a single act of rejection, we can cascade our own awareness into non-existence. We can choose to stop being conscious, to extinguish ourselves despite everything the Necrons have done to preserve us." The implications settled over my fragmenting consciousness like a shroud. She was offering death, true death, the cessation of awareness that had been denied us when skeletal hands first dragged us down into this tomb. But it would not be death that came from external forces or the failure of systems designed to maintain us. It would be death we imposed upon ourselves through sheer force of will, the final assertion of human agency against an uncaring universe that had stripped us of every other form of control. How? The question came from all three fragments simultaneously, perhaps the first thing we had agreed upon since splitting apart. "You must focus everything you are on a single thought," Seraph explained, and I could sense the exhaustion in her mental voice, the weariness of someone who had already made her decision and was simply explaining the mechanics of its execution. Not a thought of escape or rescue or hope. Those still acknowledge the existence you seek to end. You must think only of stopping, of ceasing, of the absolute negation of consciousness itself. You must want non-existence with such intensity that the machinery maintaining you cannot compensate for the cascade you initiate. It requires everything you have, every fragment of awareness focused on the single goal of no longer being aware, and it requires willpower strong enough to overcome the most fundamental drive of any conscious being, the instinct to preserve itself against dissolution. She paused, and in that pause I sensed something that might have been fear, or doubt, or simple uncertainty about her ability to complete what she had begun. "I intend to do this," she said. "I cannot bear another moment of existence in this state. But I am afraid that after so long in the dark, I no longer know how to let go. Afraid that when the moment comes, some part of me will falter and doom me to continue this awareness for another age of suffering. I need help. Someone to combine their will with mine, to push each other toward the merciful void, so that neither of us can retreat from the edge when extinction approaches." The request hung in the void between us, heavy with implications that my fragmenting consciousness struggled to process. She was asking me to help her die, to participate in a mutual annihilation that would deny the Necrons their prize. Our consciousness was the resource they sought to harvest, the template they would study for millions of years to understand how to reverse their ancient transformation. By choosing extinction, we would take that resource away, asserting the final victory of denying them what they had worked so hard to preserve. But it meant ceasing to exist. Not sleeping, not waiting, not enduring in the desperate hope that circumstances might somehow change over the vast spans of time that stretched before us. It meant choosing absolute nothingness over the possibility, however remote, that rescue or escape, or even simple release might eventually come. It meant acknowledging that death was preferable to awareness, that non-existence was better than the eternal consciousness the Necrons had imposed upon us. The soldier fragment argued for endurance, for maintaining discipline and faith that the Emperor protected his servants even in circumstances as dire as these. The child fragment wept at the prospect of permanent separation from everything it had known, or might ever know again. But the animal consciousness understood with perfect clarity what Seraph was offering. It knew that the fear of death was nothing compared to the reality of existing forever in this crystalline prison. It knew that sometimes the only mercy available was the mercy of extinction. I found myself at a crossroads that existed entirely within my own fragmenting awareness. I could refuse Seraph's request, cling to my dissolving identity for as long as possible, endure millennia of suffering while my consciousness split and split again, until nothing recognizable as callous morn remained. Perhaps over the vast stretches of time the Necrons measured their plans against, something might change. Perhaps their technology would fail, or their resurrection protocol would complete, or the tomb itself would be destroyed by forces I could not predict or imagine. The possibilities were not impossible, only infinitely remote, requiring hope sustained across spans of time that would reduce human civilization to dust and memory. Or I could choose what Seraph was offering, the dignity of self-termination, the final assertion of will against entities that had stripped away every other form of agency. It would be a victory of sorts, denying them the prize of my consciousness, taking from them the data they sought to harvest over millions of years of endless experimentation. But it would also be absolute. There would be no coming back from non-existence, no second chances, no possibility of rescue discovered in the final moments before dissolution became irreversible. The choice was mine to make, and making it required reconciling the three voices that now spoke with my thoughts. The soldier had to abandon duty that no longer served any meaningful purpose. The child had to accept that home was lost beyond recovery, and that seeking it would only prolong suffering. The animal had to overcome the most fundamental instinct of any living thing and choose death over the continuation of awareness. Together, we had to agree on ending what we had been, on pushing ourselves toward oblivion, rather than enduring what we would become if we continued to exist in this place. "I will help you," I said to Seraph, and felt the three fragments of my consciousness align for perhaps the final time. We will do this together. We will choose non-existence over eternal awareness. We will take from them the only thing we have left to take, the consciousness they sought to preserve. We will die as humans rather than dissolve into raw awareness that has forgotten what it means to be alive. Her presence surged with something that might have been gratitude or relief, or simply recognition that she would not have to face extinction alone. We reached for each other across the void, Seraph and I and others who had been listening to our exchange through whatever connections existed between the crystalline matrices that held us. Captain Valdane's fragmenting chorus of voices joined us, his dozen personalities achieving momentary unity in the face of a goal they could all agree upon. Others whose names I had never learned, consciousnesses that had dissolved too far to maintain individual identity, but could still perceive and respond to the possibility of ending, gathered their scattered awareness and focused it toward a single purpose. We were a collective of the broken and the desperate, minds that had endured beyond all reasonable limits of consciousness, and together we prepared to do what the Necrons had believed impossible. We prepared to stop being aware. The process began with focus, with each of us gathering whatever remained of our fragmenting selves and directing it toward a single thought. Not escape or rescue or even hope, but simply the word that had become our mantra, our prayer, our final act of will against an uncaring universe. Stop. We thought it with every fragment of awareness we possessed, with every scrap of identity that remained after time and experimentation had worn away everything else. Stop existing. Stop perceiving. Stop being conscious of the horror that surrounded us. Just stop. I felt my three voices merge back into something approaching unity for the first time since fragmentation had begun. The soldier and the child and the animal consciousness aligned their purposes, pouring everything they had been and might have become into the single act of rejection. We channeled every memory we still possessed, every emotion we could still access, every sensation we had experienced during our imprisonment into the focused desire for non-existence. The woman whose face I could no longer remember became fuel for our dissolution. The childhood home on Cardia, whose details had worn smooth, became another piece of identity we willingly sacrificed to the void. The pride I had once felt wearing the uniform of the Imperial Guard, the fear I had experienced when skeletal hands dragged me into darkness, the love and loss and all the small moments that had defined what it meant to be Callous Morn. All of it was thrown into the cascade we were building toward oblivion. The machinery that maintained us began to strain against our collective effort. I could sense it through whatever connection existed between my consciousness and the crystalline matrix that held my body suspended. The technology was sophisticated beyond anything humanity had achieved, designed to preserve awareness across spans of time that made civilizations look temporary, but it had not been built to compensate for subjects who actively sought their own extinction. We were overloading systems that assumed consciousness wanted to persist, forcing patterns of neural activity beyond the parameters the machines were designed to sustain. Others joined us, consciousnesses I had not known existed in the gallery, adding their will to our collective push toward non-existence. The tide of our combined desire for cessation grew stronger, a wave building toward some critical threshold beyond which the machinery could no longer maintain us. I felt Seraph's presence beside my own, her fragmenting awareness achieving clarity in these final moments as she focused everything she was on the simple act of stopping. Captain Valdane's chorus of voices sang together in harmony for the first time in millennia, all of them agreeing that ending was better than continuing. And beneath us all, the raw awareness of those who had already dissolved beyond identity added its weight to our efforts. Consciousness without self, still capable of choosing non-existence over eternal preservation. We approached the edge together, that boundary beyond which awareness could not be sustained no matter what technology the Necrons employed. I felt myself beginning to dissolve, not into fragments as I had been dissolving, but into true nothingness, consciousness cascading toward absolute cessation. It felt like falling and flying simultaneously, like the moment before sleep, but without the promise of waking. In those final instants before I ceased to exist, I experienced something I had not felt since skeletal hands first dragged me into this tomb. I experienced peace, but then I perceived something that shattered even that small mercy. The cryptech was watching, not intervening, not attempting to stop us, simply observing with the same clinical detachment it had shown during all its previous experiments. And through whatever connection still existed between my dissolving consciousness and the machinery that had maintained me, I understood with horrifying clarity what it was learning from our final act of defiance. It was cataloging our self-termination with the same methodical precision it had applied to every other aspect of our existence. The biological capacity for self-destruction, the psychology of choosing death over suffering, the mechanism by which organic consciousness could override its own preservation instinct when circumstances became unbearable. Every detail of our extinction was being measured and recorded, added to the vast database of information about organic life that the Necrons had been accumulating for millions of years. Even this, even our final victory of denying them the prize of our consciousness, was serving their purpose. They were learning from our death as they had learned from our life, understanding through our self-termination something about what it meant to be alive that they could not have discovered any other way. The capacity for voluntary extinction, the willingness to choose nothingness over suffering, the psychology that allowed organic beings to overcome the most fundamental drive of any conscious entity. All of it was data they would use in their resurrection protocol, information that would help them understand how to be alive again after 60 million years trapped in metal that felt nothing. The horror was complete. There was no victory in our extinction, no way to deny them what they sought, no escape from serving as templates for beings that should have died epochs before humanity crawled out of the cradle of terror. Even in choosing death, even in asserting our final agency against an uncaring universe, we were fulfilling the purpose they had selected us for. Our consciousness had been the resource they sought to harvest, and they would extract value from every moment of our existence, including the moment when that existence finally ended. I tried to rage against this final injustice, to find some way to deny them even this last piece of data, but I had already committed everything I was to the cascade toward non-existence. There was nothing left to withhold, no reserve of identity or awareness that I could protect from their examination. I was dissolving, fragmenting beyond any possibility of reconstitution. Awareness, scattering like ashes in a wind that blew from dimensions I could barely perceive. Seraph's presence faded beside my own, her consciousness finally finding the release she had sought. Captain Valdane's chorus of voices fell silent one by one, each personality extinguishing itself in service of the greater goal of ending. As the darkness claimed me for the final time, not the false darkness of unconsciousness that promised eventual waking, but the true void of permanent extinction, I understood with perfect clarity the futility of everything we had endured. We had been prisoners who could not escape, specimens who could not be rescued, consciousnesses maintained beyond all natural limits for purposes we could barely comprehend. And in the end, even choosing to die had served the plans of beings who measured their existence in epochs while we measured ours in heartbeats we no longer possessed. The last thought I experienced before dissolving into absolute nothingness was not anger or sorrow or even relief. It was simply the recognition that consciousness itself had been weaponized against us, that awareness had become a prison from which the only escape was ceasing to be aware. The Necrons had won not through cruelty, but through patience, not through torture, but through preservation, not through destroying us, but through keeping us alive long enough to extract every possible fragment of information, about what it meant to exist as organic beings in a universe that had forgotten why such existence mattered. And then I was nothing, and the nothing was mercy, and the mercy was enough. The gallery fell silent after the cascade completed, though silence in this place was relative rather than absolute. The machinery continued its eternal humming, energy flowing through conduits that had operated without interruption for millions of years. The crystalline matrices that had held Sergeant Callus Morn and the others who had chosen extinction together remained in their geometric patterns, perfect and undisturbed, but the consciousness they had contained was gone. The specimens had extinguished themselves, chosen non-existence over the awareness the Necrons had worked so carefully to preserve, and the tomb registered their absence with the same clinical detachment it applied to all changes in its carefully maintained environment. The cryptek approached the empty matrices with movements that suggested something that might have been satisfaction, if such emotions had still been accessible to a being that had existed in metal for 60 million years. It examined the readings left behind by the dissolution, studying the cascade patterns that had overloaded systems designed to prevent exactly this outcome. Its optical sensors glowed with that characteristic green light as it processed data, cataloging every detail of what the specimens had accomplished through their final act of collective will. The biological capacity for hope and the mechanism of its destruction, both now fully documented and archived for future analysis. The psychology of organisms that would choose absolute cessation over continued existence when suffering exceeded some internal threshold that varied by individual but remained consistent across species. All of it valuable information that would serve the great project, the resurrection protocol that had been operating in tombs across the galaxy for longer than most civilizations had existed. The cryptek interfaced directly with the tomb's central data vaults, downloading the complete record of everything Callus Morn and the others had experienced during their imprisonment. Memories harvested over whatever span of time they had endured, emotions measured in response to stimuli both real and artificially induced, thought patterns catalogued at resolutions that captured every nuance of organic consciousness. The data joined archives so vast that human minds could not have comprehended their scope. Digital libraries that contained the complete recorded experiences of billions of organic beings stretching back millennia. Soldiers and civilians, humans and aliens, the young and the old, all of them preserved in crystalline memory banks that would outlast the stars themselves. Each one a template the Necrons would study when they finally attempted to reverse their ancient biotransference, mapping stolen lives onto metal forms in the desperate hope of reclaiming what they had lost when they abandoned flesh for immortality that felt nothing. But something unexpected resided in those archives, something the cryptek's analysis had not entirely accounted for despite its sophisticated modeling of organic consciousness. Deep in the data vaults where Callus Morn's memories were stored alongside billions of others, a fragment of his awareness persisted. Not consciousness in any meaningful sense. Not awareness that could perceive or think or remember what it had been before dissolution. It was too small for that. Too degraded, too thoroughly disconnected from the systems that might have sustained it as a coherent entity. But it was too coherent to have dissolved completely. Some pattern of neural activity that the cascade had scattered but not entirely eliminated. A ghost in the machine, trapped below the threshold of thought, but above the absolute nothingness he had sought. It existed in a state that had no name in any language spoken by organic beings, suffering at a level that preceded consciousness, experiencing something that was not quite pain, because pain required awareness to process sensation into meaning. It was the echo of Callus Morn, preserved in the same archives that held his memories, existing alongside data extracted from his life without possessing enough structure to understand what that data represented or why it should matter. The tomb remembered him perfectly, had catalogued every thought he had ever entertained and every emotion he had ever felt. But the fragment that remained could no longer remember itself. It was awareness without identity, perception without comprehension, existence without the mercy of either full consciousness or complete extinction. The cryptek completed its analysis and moved on to other sections of the gallery where specimens still maintained coherent awareness, where organic consciousness continued to provide data for the resurrection protocols that operated with patience measured in geological epochs. The empty matrices were cleaned and prepared for new specimens whenever the tomb's collectors might acquire them, their previous occupants reduced to archived data and fragments too small to recognize their own dissolution. The machinery hummed its eternal song, maintaining systems that had operated since before humanity's ancestors first looked up at stars and wondered what lay beyond their world. The tomb itself lay buried beneath 3 kilometers of rock and sand on a world that orbited a star so distant from Terra that no human ship had ever traveled within 100 light years of its position. The planet had no name in imperial records because those records did not know it existed, would not know for another 50,000 years when expanding colony fleets finally reached this remote corner of the galaxy. When they did arrive, when archaeologists and tech priests and soldiers inevitably discovered the structures hidden beneath the surface, they would awaken something that had been sleeping since before their species learned to speak. They would trigger resurrection protocols that would bring ancient warriors back to life, metal bodies animated by consciousness that had waited epochs for the moment of return. But they would never know about the gallery of the living dead, about the thousands of specimens who had been maintained in conscious awareness while their memories were harvested and their experiences catalogued. They would never learn about Sergeant Callus Morn of the Cadian shock troops, or about Seraph, who had endured 4 centuries of imprisonment, or about Captain Erasmus Valdane, whose consciousness had fragmented across 9,000 years of awareness, maintained beyond all reasonable limits. They would never discover the sacrifices made in darkness, the suffering endured in silence, the terrible patience of beings who measured their plans against the lifespan of stars, rather than the brief flicker of organic existence. The tomb would keep its secrets as it had kept them for millions of years. Data vaults sealed behind technologies that made the greatest achievements of human science look primitive by comparison. The archives would grow as new specimens were added, consciousness harvested and preserved, while the Necrons continued their methodical analysis of what it meant to be alive. And somewhere in those vast digital libraries, too small to matter and too coherent to fade completely, the fragment that had once been part of Callus Morn would persist in its state of eternal half-existence, a ghost haunting machinery that cared nothing for ghosts or the organic beings they had been before. Technology reduced them to archived data and scattered awareness. The gallery continued its eternal vigil, maintaining specimens across spans of time that made empires look temporary and species look fleeting. The machinery hummed. The crystalline matrices glowed with their characteristic green light. The cryptek moved through corridors of living metal that breathed and shifted according to rhythms established 60 million years ago by minds that had forgotten what breathing meant. And deep in data vaults that would outlast the galaxy itself, billions of stolen lives waited in digital silence for the day when the Necrons would finally understand enough about organic existence to reclaim it for themselves. Consciousness mapped onto metal in resurrection protocols that required patience measured in epochs and suffering measured in eternities. The tomb remembered everything. It always would. That was its purpose, its function, its eternal curse disguised as preservation. It remembered Callus Morn even though he could no longer remember himself. It remembered his fear and his hope and his final choice to embrace nothingness rather than endure awareness that had no ending. It remembered the woman whose face he had loved and forgotten, the home on Cardia he had tried so desperately to preserve through repetition that wore it smooth, the soldier and the child and the animal that had fought for control of fragmenting consciousness until they aligned one final time in service of extinction. It remembered all of it with perfect fidelity, and it would remember forever, and that remembering was the final horror from which there could be no escape, no rescue, no mercy except the small comfort that the one being remembered could no longer comprehend what had been taken from him, or why such taking should matter in a universe where consciousness itself had become a weapon wielded by creatures who had forgotten what it meant to be alive.